Hello and welcome to another episode of the Women's Imaging MinnieCast, brought to you by AntMinnie.com. I'm your host, Amerigo Allegretto, and today's episode will continue discussion on risk-based cancer screening versus annual mammography screening. On our last episode, we spoke with Dr. Vielert Loving about this issue and criticism toward the Wisdom trial, which found that risk-based screening is on par with annual screening when it comes to patient outcomes. Today we speak with two experts who are part of the Wisdom trial. They include Dr. Jeffrey Tice, a professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco, and Dr. Habib Rahbar, a board-certified radiologist from the University of Washington in Seattle. The doctors will talk about the method behind risk-based cancer screening, including how it addresses challenges tied to mammography screening. They also address criticism levied against the study by the American College of Radiology and the Society of Breast Imaging. Finally, we briefly discuss how artificial intelligence could be key to better assessing women's risk of developing breast cancer. It's a controversial topic among breast imagers, but we do hope our viewers and listeners can take something informative away from these episodes. We thank you for your continued support. Enjoy the show. All right, so first of all, just to get things rolling, can you explain the concept of risk-based screening and how it differs from current breast cancer screening recommendations?
Sure. I can take a stab at it. The primary difference is that the only risk factor that's traditionally been used for breast cancer screening has been age. And each guideline has a different starting age, but that's really been the only risk factor that's guided us. But we know women's risk varies dramatically. So the whole premise behind our study was to take resources that are being used to screen low-risk women and repurpose them to screen high-risk women more intensively and earlier, to try and optimize breast cancer screening to really ultimately prevent death from breast cancer, which unfortunately still kills about 40,000 women a year in the United States.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Tice. Essentially, we've been doing some form of risk-based screening for quite some time, ever since we developed the use of contrast-based MRI. What we learned is that patients who are at the highest risk can benefit from getting supplemental screening with contrast-based MRI. And those are patients who have greater than 20 to 25% lifetime risk of developing breast cancer. But that's a pretty small fraction of the population who qualify for that. And otherwise, we're sort of just giving everyone a one-size-fits-all at age 40, recommending annual screening mammography. There's been some debate over the years as whether it should start at 40, should start at a later age, whether it should be biennial. And this has led to some, various levels of confusion. And really, it doesn't take into account the fact that breast cancer is very, very common, but most women won't develop breast cancer in their lifetimes. But we're screening them all exactly at the same cadence. And what we'd like to get to is one that personalizes the screening approach to their risk. It's been a little bit elusive because the risk factors that we use generally to identify risk are common in the population. And until recently, with advances, we haven't had as elegant ways of determining individual risk.
I will say one of the unique things about the Wisdom study was that we were, in the personalized or risk-based arm, we were screening everybody for hereditary breast cancer genes and mutations in those genes. And a third of women who we identified as carrying one of these high-risk genes had no family history and never would have been identified unless we were doing population-based screening for these mutations. And I guess I'll say one more thing. We also screened women without a mutation, but who were at very high risk, who had the same risk as a BRCA carrier, which is actually a little bit higher than the American Cancer Society recommendations to think about 20 to 25%. BRCA carriers, their lifetime risk is more like 40 to 65%, sort of twice what that threshold is. But put together a number of different risk factors. Sometimes women without a hereditary mutation had the same 5-year risk as a BRCA carrier. That's around 6% 5-year risk for women ages 40 to 74, the sort of typical, the core age range where we screen for breast cancer.
And in your experience, why is there such an aversion to the typical annual mammography screening by some women?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. I can start with it from my perspective. I think that the decision on whether a woman decides to be screened for breast cancer is complicated because unlike some things like we might consider other prevention approaches like blood pressure medication or, patient who might be pre-diabetic and they take medication to help prevent something from progressing and an eventual thing happening. With breast cancer screening, we're not really able to prevent breast cancer. We're looking to detect it. So the fact that we're looking to detect it early creates anxiety. And the idea that a test can be abnormal might lead to biopsies, it might lead to the diagnosis or confirmation. That leads to some people not wanting necessarily to have the actual procedure done. So the anxiety is one component of it. There's some component of people having mistrust of the medical system, and that has historical components to it. So we definitely have seen that marginalized women, traditionally marginalized populations, may be less likely to have screening, and something we had to be very thoughtful of in terms of how we explain the value of screening mammography. There's also pain associated with mammography. It's not always the most comfortable examination. Most women wouldn't choose to have it if they didn't think it was going to improve their health, and some women find it less comfortable than others. And then there's even some component of overdiagnosis, and that can be a word that some folks will take umbrage with and say it doesn't really truly happen. I think most of us accept if you screen populations for any disease, you're going to find some forms of the disease that probably didn't matter if we had never detected it. And so the idea that women are becoming increasingly savvy and understand that they could be getting something that will detect something that doesn't matter, which will lead to a whole cascade of events. And they may just decide, I don't want to deal with this. And we see this also with other cancers like prostate cancer. Some men choose to not have a PSA screen, for example, because it could lead to an overdiagnosis of a prostate abnormality that doesn't actually need to be treated. So it's not inherent to just breast cancer. So it's a complicated decision, and one that often requires shared decision making. And so one solution might be, let's say, hey, let's just make it really simple and say everyone should get screened. But as we get more advanced in our society and women have more nuanced thinking, I think having a screening approach that matches patients to their true risk helps mitigate a lot of those concerns. And that's why I think trials like the WISDOM trial are really important to evaluate.
And how does risk-based screening aim to address these concerns?
Well, and I think we, the first thing we did was educate women about the tests even before we did them. We made sure that they knew that they could get, learned that they have a hereditary risk for breast cancer, and we let them know that has implications for their family members. That's one of the unique things about genetic testing. If you test positive for a mutation in a gene, that means you got it almost certainly from one of your parents, and that means your extended family may be at risk for it. And it's really important for people to understand that before they even get the test, because they have to think through what they're going to do. Sometimes they want to communicate with family members ahead of time and let them know that they're getting that information, check in whether the family members would want to know if there is something. So anyway, we do a lot to try and help women understand their risk factors, things that can be done to reduce their risk, and we found that with all of the testing and with all the education up front, and then the testing, and then having people available to discuss the results with women, overall, the people in the personalized arm had lower levels of anxiety than those in the annual screening arm. But it took a lot of work. We generated, as you probably know, we recruited women from all 50 states. So we did a lot of work where women could find out about the study, sign up online, but get a lot of this education through videos and things that we already had online to educate women, so that reduced the amount of person time to do that. But we also had breast health specialists who were mostly trained genetic counselors. They're wonderful counselors. They have a great bedside manner, and they were available for the people who were enrolled. And we actively reached out to anybody who tested positive or was very high risk. We had the breast health specialists reach out to them.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Tice here. I mean, it's so important that we find ways to educate our patients. You know, education is power and knowledge is power. And we have to get to a point where we understand that if we don't educate our patients, they're going to find other sources of information that may mislead them down completely wrong paths. And so it takes a lot of time and effort, and that helps deal with the anxiety tremendously. And then the other practical piece is one of the goals of the trial, even though it didn't show in this particular trial, is by matching patients to their screening cadence and screening intensivity that matches their overall risk. The goal is to decrease the unnecessary biopsies that occur, and that will decrease anxiety. That didn't happen in this trial. There was probably some reasons to that because patients often got more screening than they might necessarily have been assigned to based on their risk. But there was a really interesting study that came out from my colleague, Dr. Katie Lowry, who works at the University of Washington. She and other investigators from the Breast Cancer Surveillance Consortium showed using models that if you match patients' risk to cadence in terms of screening intensivity for mammography, you can increase the number of cancer diagnoses and decrease biopsy rates. And so there is evidence that from modeling studies that is feasible if we can get better compliance. And so I think it's a very exciting way to decrease the anxiety is to screen based on the actual risk that patients have, get more cancer diagnoses in the populations who have a higher pre-test probability of having a cancer, and decreasing the number of false positives in patients who are less likely to have breast cancer.
I'd love to elaborate on that. I think you talked to people about this paper on this podcast earlier, and the paper in JAMA Network Open showed that using the BCSC model, which was the model we used in the Wisdom trial as well. Full disclosure, I'm the person who developed the BCSC model. I work with the BCSC. I have intellectual conflict of interest here. But they showed that with using these kinds of, that risk model alone, not even using all the extra information we had in the Wisdom trial, you could decrease death from breast cancer while also decreasing biopsies. And the criticism from the American College of Radiology, I believe, on this was, but we need, this is just modeling, we need a trial. But the Wisdom trial is just that trial. We showed that we decreased the number of advanced breast cancers, the ones that kill women, the stage 2B or higher. We didn't reduce biopsies, but that was, again, because of less than ideal. I mean, it was what we call a pragmatic trial. It was a real world trial. And about both in the annual screening arm, women got screened less often, and so they had less biopsies. And in our low risk arm, women got screened more often than we recommended, and so they ended up having more biopsies. But I think we have the real data that the American College of Radiology wanted to complement this modeling study. I think the two studies together really make the case that risk-based screening should be an option. I mean, I think what we really need now is for guideline committees to come out and not say, the evidence is unequivocal that risk-based screening is the way to go, but there's evidence, the evidence is clear that it's equivalent, at least as good, and modeling says better, and it should be offered as an option. And if guidelines do that, then payers often will follow guidelines, and then we could actually implement this in the United States. And I think, in our estimate, we could reduce deaths from breast cancer by 5,000 or 10,000 women a year by doing this over the long term.
Yeah, that segues into my next question here about imaging societies criticizing the methodology behind the Wisdom trial. Some of the criticisms that I read include some women in the trial declining randomization, the study having less women in the 65,000 patient goal, and risk-based screening leading to more biopsies, which you mentioned earlier. Could you take us through some of these limitations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is just absurd. It's remarkable that 61% of the women chose to be randomized. recruitment is the hardest thing for every randomized trial. People are really uncomfortable with being randomized. And again, this is a place where, well, one, there's a long tradition in breast cancer research where women who've been affected by breast cancer, the advocates, have learned about the value of randomized trials, and that's really how we advance the science. And that we've gone from mastectomies to randomized trials of mastectomy versus radical mastectomy versus regular mastectomy, and then we went from randomized trials of mastectomy versus lumpectomy, and each time we saw so that we did at least as well, and so we've moved to less radical treatment. So we're lucky. Women have been educated about the importance of randomized trials in advancing care for women with breast cancer. We spent a lot of time educating women before, but then we gave them the choice. And literally 61%, more than half, chose to be randomized. The others were able to join an observational study, and there almost everybody wanted to do risk-based screening. So 89%, essentially 9 out of 10 who chose observational chose the risk-based. So they're really interested in that. It's in most device trials, if you allowed participants to get this newfangled device rather than the old device, everybody would just choose to get the new thing. They wouldn't agree to be randomized. I mean, I think it's actually remarkable how many women chose to be randomized. We didn't recruit as many as we wanted, and that was a problem, but we extended the length of follow-up to compensate for that. And we had our p-value for the primary outcome, the non-inferiority in terms of the 2B or higher breast cancers, was like 0.00001. I mean, plenty of power there. The other outcome, unfortunately, because of the lack of adherence to what was recommended, both in the annual arm and in the personalized arm, did lead us to not see a reduction in biopsies. But I think we had plenty of power. We almost showed superiority. I mean, if you look at figure 3 in the paper, you will see that we were very close to actually demonstrating that the personalized approach had fewer 2B or higher. It was numerically fewer, but it almost achieved statistical significance, which we didn't plan for that. We didn't hope for that. It was a remarkable finding, and I think really speaks to the promise of this going forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate what Dr. Tice is saying here, and I agree with him for the most part. I do want to say, I'm a radiologist and a member of the societies that is providing some of this criticism, and I think some of it, it comes from a place where so many who are part of these societies, many are extremely good people. I know them well, and I respect them tremendously. They are very passionate about advancing imaging science to identify breast cancer as early as possible. They know that breast cancer screening is one of the major contributions to reduction in mortality and morbidity from breast cancer. And they've chosen to take that profession on and continue to advance the science of it. And they have there are some probably who feel like maybe this is deja vu around other trials that seem to indicate that breast cancer screening with mammography wasn't as effective as they believed it to be and maybe shouldn't be done at all. And the Wisdom trial isn't saying that. And I think that's maybe where some of the miscommunication is happening. And I think the radiologists all agree that a true risk-based approach, one that we can trust and feel comfortable with, is preferable to a blanket recommendation of everyone getting screened annually at age 40. One where we're truly screening patients based on risk. The Wisdom trial isn't saying that age-based screening is bad. It's just asking the question, hey, can we do something that works well, but do it even better? Can we leverage the technologies that we have, the increased information that we have about risk, and the newer technologies around better sensitivity of detection of breast cancer, like with MRI and contrast-enhanced mammography, and applied to the right patients? And so I think, the idea that that we should just screen everybody mammographically at age 40 is one that is not going to last long term. We are definitely going to get to risk-based screening. And I do commend the Wisdom trial investigators for taking on a really challenging, charged topic and a difficult trial to run. Anyone who's ever developed a clinical trial knows that they're all imperfect and they're really hard to accrue into. And they did a great job getting patients into this trial in a practical way and showing a proof of concept that this can be done. And they're not stopping there. I mean, there's plans to do additional trials that are even more advanced. So I think as you know, the radiologic societies can get behind this on some level. And I think some of the initial reaction is I think their goal is to say, hey, caution, this is the first trial, maybe stated, I think, a little too aggressively, in my mind, in my personal opinion, because I think we all really want to get to a place of risk-based screening.
I agree totally. And, clearly we have a large number of radiologists who are working with us. We totally respect the point of view of the societies. I understand where they're coming from. They're trying to save lives. That's why we're continuing the dialogue. It's really important that we all eventually get to the same place. I like to look to the example of screening for cervical cancer, where it used to be the annual, right? and that was it. And now the OBGYN societies are, every 3 years once you have a couple of normals. And if you have a negative HPV as well, you can do it every 5 years. Everybody's gotten behind it. So as the evidence accrues, hopefully practice will change. And clearly this is where we're going. We've partnered with a trial in Europe that's going on called MyPEBS, which is also doing risk-based screening in a randomized setting. So we'll have more information there. And there are other risk-based demonstration projects going on. So I'm hoping that all of us will come together, primary care providers, breast surgeons, radiologists. We're actively looking at contrast-enhanced mammography in our updated version of Wisdom. We have a new grant to improve the risk modeling and so on. And we're actively working with our radiology colleagues, and many of them are happy to work with us, as you said. Many see this as
totally
the way of the future.
Absolutely. I mean, even in the Journal of American College of Radiology, there was a paper recently published by another one of my colleagues, Christoph Lee, and my colleague Cody Schopf, about a systematic review around AI-driven mammographic-based breast cancer risk prediction. I mean, basically, we understand in imaging, we can take those images that we have and better identify true risk. And so incorporating AI approaches down the line with images is going to be part of the future of determining who should get screened and what intensity and what types of imaging. And that's being published in the same, the journal of the organization that is talking about risk-based screening. And so we all want to get there. And I think there's just maybe just a little bit of tangled communications about what the Wisdom trial was trying to accomplish and what it's saying. I think really, I see so much more excitement out of this, and imagers really want to get to that place where we're tailoring things to women's true risk. The Wisdom trial is really cool step towards that direction.
And the Wisdom 2.0, this next grant that we have, we're incorporating AI. We're looking at 5 or 6 different AI, prediction tools using AI on mammograms, and it's really, really promising. And we're combining it with improved polygenic risk scores, these small genetic risk factors that you can put together to have a very powerful predictor along with clinical risk factors. And putting them all together is even better than what we had for Wisdom 1.0. The technology advances really quickly now, and we can do much better risk-based screening right now than we could when we designed the Wisdom trial. And hopefully we'll be convincing all stakeholders that this is the right way to move forward and continue to gather the information demonstrating that this is really improving the health of the women that we're really aiming to serve here.
Well, we'll certainly be looking forward to those results. Any other thoughts before I let you two go today?
I just want to underscore how exciting a time it is to be in breast cancer screening. We have so many tools that are coming down the pike. I mentioned a little bit about mammography is just one piece of the puzzle. We have contrast-based approaches, which were included in the Wisdom trial, like MRI and then CEM, which we're doing trials on to better understand its value relative to MRI. And then, my colleagues are working on non-contrast MRI approaches that might be able to expand access to even greater populations. And we better understand disparities in breast cancer diagnosis and increasing our emphasis on on how we can identify women who are at highest risk of developing more aggressive cancers at younger ages, especially African American and Black women. And so it's an exciting time to be an investigator. And I, as a radiologist, I love working with my surgical and internal medicine, medical oncology, radiation oncology colleagues to come up with the solutions together. I think that's the only way forward. And it's just really been a privilege to talk with you today and with Dr. Tice as well.
Yeah, I will say, I'm glad you brought that up. The one other element of our next version of Wisdom is we're doing risk assessment at age 30 because we realize those at high genetic risk, they start getting their breast cancers in their 30s, and we're missing them with our current approach to screening. And again, unless we're doing population-based screening, which the genetic testing that we did costs about 1/10 the cost of an MRI. I mean, the cost of doing genetic testing has come down so enormously over the last 20 years. It really isn't a big expense to get the information, and by doing it at age 30, we're hoping to, identify those women who aren't identified by family history and other testing right now, and get them early screening before we would normally start with population-based screening. And a big part of our work, we work very closely with a group out of the University of Chicago where they've developed better genetic risk assessments, particularly in people of African descent, and we're tailoring all of our risk models to each different race ethnicity subgroup in the population to try and address some of the disparity issues, because Black women in the United States die at a much higher rate. Part of it is they're at risk for these aggressive early cancers that are triple negative, but part of it is access. Both systemic racism and suspicion of the medical system because of what's happened medically to African Americans in this country. But then also just socioeconomically, it takes time to come into a mammogram. And if people have jobs where they don't get paid when they go in for a medical visit, that's a real burden. And then if they have to get called back for follow-up imaging, they tend to do it at lower rates, and part of it reflects just the economic pressures that many people are under. So there are many different issues that need to be addressed to improve, to really reduce mortality from breast cancer in this country.
That's all for today's show. Be sure to check out AuntMinnie.com's Women's Imaging section for the latest news and research, policy, and practice management. Come back soon for the next episode of the Women's Imaging MinnieCast and listen to other podcast series we have on AuntMinnie.com. We thank you for your continued support. Until next time.